Welcome all, and a special welcome to cultural and gender activist, advocate, and award-winning writer Opal Adisa. I am Dr. Geraldine Skeete, lecturer in literatures and English at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. I am an admirer of Opal's work and have interviewed her for our podcast series, The Spaces Between Words, Conversations with Writers, produced by our Literatures and English section. I also published a conference paper as a 2021 article entitled Frank Discussions in Verse, What Women Tell Each Other in Opal Adisa's Four-Headed Woman in the Caribbean Journal of Education's special issue, Poetry Beyond Borders. Today, she and I will be chatting about her 2022 publication, The Storyteller's Return, Story Poems. This poetry collection, like the rest of her body of work in all genres, focuses on the lives of women and girls, and men and boys, motherhood, mothering, the matriarchal figure, gender inequality and gender justice, folklore and myth, ancestral memory and rituals, communal bonds, and national identity, just to name a few. I wish to read the poem Turning from The Storyteller's Return as we start our discussion, and then I will invite you, Opal, to continue by please reading a poem of your choice from the collection.
Thank you.
Turning. In the house she shared with her mother and sister, her bed was pushed up against the wall. At nights, the croaking lizards taunted her. Having survived the dark days of the cocoon, the storyteller heard the ebbing thundering, bouncing from hill to valley to treetop to ocean waves, where their ancestors held their breaths, dove below blue waters to gift a world too young to even crawl, the blueprint of crossing a passage that didn't occur in the middle. This was a storyteller's most anthologized tale. She holds the enamel cup on her lap, filled with a rich chocolate tea her grandmother made, grating cocoa and nutmeg, boiling coconut milk, mixing in molasses. Home is buried in memory and nostalgia.
Thank you. I love how you read that. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Is called Memories. And of course, a lot of the storytelling is about, this collection is about memories. Home is a lie. Emotions subvert everything. Historians are trustworthy. Home smells like a freshly cut lime, seeds dug out before being squeezed into the glass, pulp clinging to the lid. Home is a dresser drawer pulled open, rummaged through, and under tissue paper and nylon slips are letters wrapped in a handkerchief. The cursive lean and slanted, words are smeared. I did not mean to blank, blank, blank. What's legible is a mystery. It was such a long time. Whole lines faded. Watermark trails. Your father was a man sealed into a buried home. Grandma insists that I listen. Home is a fishbowl, she laughs, falling off the chair. Her tears water the plants.
Thank you. Now, Opal, it's known that common related tropes in Caribbean literature are migration and homecoming. The storyteller's return epitomizes this preoccupation, particularly as it relates to homecoming, to returning and the nostalgic experiences, and particularly the challenges of being a returnee. Now, even though we caution our literature students to be wary of always conflating the persona and or speaker with the poet, unless there's evident proof, our awareness of your personal context may tempt the reader, it tempted me, to align you with both the storyteller and returnee in this poetry collection. And we know that writers draw on their own observations and experiences. Certainly, this collection is autobiographical or at the least semi-autobiographical, you having lived away from Jamaica for so many years and now resettling there with a new way of seeing and opining about your home country.
Mhm. Yeah, you're right. It is very much autobiographical. Not all of it pertains to me, but I have lived away. And when I came back, I said I wanted to write a collection about returning and how the memories I have of living here and growing up here as a child now fits in with the memory and what I'm and the experiences that I'm having. Both the my memory, the ancestral memory, and the storyteller played an important part in my childhood and used to play an important part in the Caribbean. So I wanted that notion of the storyteller to be very much active and present in this collection.
Okay, right. Now, the first poem is Rubicon.
Mhm,
The penultimate is Sankofa.
mhm,
And the last is Returning to Return. I really liked that thematic structuring, the thematic structuring of the poems. And I also really liked how you ended your poems with consolidating and declarative statements about home,
mhm.
conveying the many meanings, types, paradoxes, and contradictions of home. I think that is such a successful feature of the storyteller's return. Do talk a bit about that.
Yes. So I really thought in doing this collection a lot about the whole notion of home and what was the kind of declarative statement that I wanted to say. And obviously, the declarative statement is not consistent throughout. You point to those very three poems. So that was, if you might say, the technique that connects them with each other. And then it was about also there's a lot nowadays about coming home, and I got a lot of anxiety from families, but mostly friends and colleagues who thought, well, given what they hear about Jamaica, that this was not necessarily a good time to come home, which of course I did not take any attention to, and coming home has been actually really good. So I wanted to show what happens when you leave, and that in a sense, every time you leave, you have to make up a new story. We all make up stories about ourselves, which we think are true because we tell them so many times. And then, the whole Sankofa is such an important image for Caribbean people or for Black people in the diaspora. And for those people who don't know, it's a symbol of the Adingra symbol of the bird who's looking back, going back to retrieve what you lost. And I really feel in coming home that I did in fact retrieve some of what I lost. And then, of course, the last poem is Being Home. And um, um, just also celebrating, just what it means to return and whether or not that whole notion of whether or not one can return is possible. And I guess that's why the title is Returning to Return, because one is always returning evil when one is here or evil in the diaspora. I have friends and other relatives who for years said they're coming home, and they really in one place in their minds and in their bodies believe that, but in another place that has not been possible for them.
Yeah, kind of liminal space that they inhabit. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right. Now, very interesting too. And another thing I really liked is that you include a female griot in Days of Return 3. The persona's great grand Aunt Zilla, who is the quote unquote village griot, and
Mhm.
taught the persona and her siblings, quote unquote, the value of life. Now, we generally tend to think of the griot as male, even though there are indeed female griots in Africa, for instance.
Mhm.
Did you encounter any female griots in your real life experience?
My Aunt Zilla is real. She's
Ah,
my,
okay,
she
so that
is,
is
yeah,
autobiographical.
she
Okay,
is my great, well, she died about
okay.
10 years ago at the age of 102. But
Oh,
she is my great grand aunt who helped to raise my mother.
okay.
And my mother would send us, my sister and I, there when we were young during the summer to spend at least 2 weeks with her. And she really was the one who had the history of the family. And she
Mhm.
was an amazing storyteller. So,
Right.
in a sense, that is definitely biographical.
Mhm.
And yes, there are many griots who are female, and we tend not to remember that because
Mhm.
so much male images of griots have been presented to us. But
Mhm.
the matrilineal line has always been important to me, even though there have been strong men in my family, on both sides of my family. But it's the women and their storytelling and
Mhm.
their recounting of history that has been important to me and that has fed me, in terms of both the familial story and the village or the community stories.
Yeah. So there's that strong ancestral, those strong ancestral traces in your family. We
Yes.
talk about the ancestral tracing in the blood, so okay. Now in my email interview with you for my article on Four-Headed Woman, you had indicated that it was and I'm quoting you, first collection which was conceived before the poems were actually created, unquote. That people overlook the experimentation in your work with respect to what is quote unquote both on the page and what the page looks like. That's another quote. And that you usually write long poems, but within part 4 of that book, you opted not to present a poem exceeding a page. Now, in the Storyteller's Return, the same thing applies where throughout the book, all the poems do not go beyond a page except for two, Days of Return and Keyman, Lock the Door and Gone.
Right.
You-
So this collection, as I said, I had been thinking about it before I came home, and when I came home, I said I wanted to do a collection about return. And
Mhm.
the initial title of the collection was the last poem, Returning to
Okay.
Return.
Mhm.
And I was also very conscious that I'm a long poet. I'm a narrative poet primarily.
Yes.
And so I wanted to give myself the opportunity to write shorter poems and to see how I could convey the same idea of a shorter poem in this collection. So the collection, which is, I think it's a level of maturity. I
Yes.
think I heard Kai Miller say that he thinks about a collection before he actually starts to write. But normally, as I said in the past, except for the Four-Headed Woman and now this collection, I had not thought about a collection before. I don't know where that annoying
Probably out in the street.
yeah, somewhere out in the street.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was conceived that way, very deliberately, and although I wasn't aware of the sections and how it would develop, but the idea of writing a book about returning and writing a book about memory and writing a book about what it means to return was a very much an idea before the actual poems came into being.
Yeah, because more of what I had to say about that is that you also structurally, that is numerically, play around with the order of some of the poems. So by, for example, what you do with the sorting, Days of Return and Home series of poems. And the subtitle of the book is, of course, story poems, linking these concepts of narrative and storyteller and of how poetry is also a form of storytelling. So I wanted to ask, in light of all this, to tell us a bit about your thoughts and decisions as you crafted and drafted the collection. You've answered a bit of that already. So I don't know if there's more that you want to say or if you feel you've already explained.
Well, because I think I cheated a little. So I usually write long poems, right? So rather than writing long poems, I'm writing, you have turning one, two, three, four. So that's the way I cheated, I think, in terms of rather than writing a long poem, I'm writing that. But I also was questioning the whole notion in a book of having a collection of a collection of poems, but then having them have each separate titles. Because I felt in this collection specifically, it was a series of poems that was connected to the original title, right?
Yes.
So whatever the title, the series title was. So that was also part of the technique in that, yeah, these are all poems about knowing. And in each part of knowing, it goes from knowing three to knowing 11, and
Mhm.
it goes from turning to turning 10 kind of stuff. And because what I wanted to suggest that in each of these movements, each time there's another level that you uncover, there's another level that you discover, but
Yeah.
that level is also connected to that first level,
Mhm.
which is why the collection is so, particularly the second part of it
Mhm.
has not individual titles. The
Mhm.
second and the third part just is a series, and then the first and the fourth part has individual titles for the most part. Although towards the end we do return to the sorting. You know, what is it? What is it? Does that mean? What is it that I'm sorting through? What are the
Mhm.
memories that are coming through this sieve of a strainer, and how am I sorting and processing that information?
Yeah.
So that was part of the technique, and I guess it's also my way of cheating. Rather than one long poem,
Right.
you get 10 little poems.
Right. Now, you include poems dealing with leitmotifs in your work, such as sexual abuse, pedophilia, incest, rape, and other acts of gender based violence, classism, sexism, and linguistic discrimination. I think you keep returning to them because we still grapple with these problems in our Caribbean societies due to complicity, silences, corruption, or colonial legacy, etc. You address menstruation, explored in length in Four-Headed Woman. And there's also a poem here, Sorting Five, on masturbation, which is
Okay.
still a very taboo topic, typified for which there's a lot of silencing, typified by a lot of silencing. I know you feel very strongly about these topics and have been open in addressing them, and many of these poems satirize these societal feelings. But tell us still more, especially within the context of this poetry collection. Tell us more about those.
So, coming home and working at the university at the Institute for Gender, heading that thing, that program, that institute, which was very fulfilling for me. I
Mhm.
was really surprised, and just have to tell you very honestly that I still grapple with why, I've been doing this work and people have been doing this work for so long, and it is still so prevalent. It's
Mhm.
very hard. It's very hard. Every week, just recently, another 13-year-old girl is raped and killed by her stepfather, and we become so accustomed to these incidences. And then I remembered that they happened, not maybe not at the frequency when I was a child, but they were whispered about,
Mhm.
right? And so part of working with this now is to say this is not new. This
Yeah.
was there under the covers, in the bush, behind the fence, and
Mhm.
and linking them, and also recognizing that there's tremendous complicity.
Yes.
Oftentimes we know, the
And
mothers
women.
know, the
Yeah.
fathers know, the
Yeah.
grandmothers know, people know that this man is terrible, and nobody says something until something horrible happens. I remember there was a man who was what we would now call, we didn't know the word then, a flasher who scared
Right.
me as a child, and I didn't tell anyone. And then I remember one day my girlfriend and I, am the same age, we were talking, and she said he did the same thing to her. And when
Right.
she told the maid, we called them maid then, the helper, the
Mhm.
helper said he did the same thing. So
Oh.
adults knew that this man was a flasher, and that was probably flashing up with in front of little girls, and
Mhm.
nobody did anything. And
Yeah.
this is really an issue in Jamaica, and I think in the rest of the Caribbean, is
Yeah.
that we know that these perverts exist. Mothers know that these men are molesting their children, and for
Mhm.
a variety of reasons, some of which is nonsensical, this whole notion of shame,
Mhm.
right? And shaming the family and all this kind of stuff, not worried about what psychological and emotional damage is happening to the children. Nobody says anything.
Yeah.
And so I really feel, and I've always felt this, that my work is to expose things. My work is to confront things. My work is to say, listen, people, we have to do better. We have to name what is happening to us if we want to heal. And so I return to these topics because they existed. And when I went back into my memory bank as a child, I realized, oh, I remember that man doing
Mhm.
that and people whispering. Because,
Mhm.
as a writer, I didn't know I was going to be a writer then, but now I know. I was
Yeah.
always considered to be nosy and always eavesdropping. And so I would always eavesdrop on what they were calling big people's conversation. And I
Mhm.
remember hearing mostly women, because that's who I had the opportunity to eavesdrop on,
Mhm.
talking about these things and saying how awful it was, but doing nothing and not warning us.
Mhm.
You
Yes.
know? So it's like I'm gonna warn you. I'm going to warn you. These poems are to warn you that these things exist and happen and they shouldn't.
Mhm. Because what I thought there was some balance because
Hmm.
I know you focus a lot on women and girls, but also on the men and the boys. So the poem where there's a homosexual pedophilia, right, where there's incest, the father
Hmm.
and the boy, I thought that was also quite poignant and something worth addressing.
Right. And I'm
To
glad
not
you
talk about
mentioned
our
that.
what mm-hmm,
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because, I'm a feminist, but I
mm-hmm,
really feel that the work that we've done for the last 30 years was really important in focusing on women and
yeah,
getting women to understand their plight and patriarchy and those kinds of stuff. And
mm-hmm,
now I realize that we have to equally focus on the women as well as the men. We can no longer just focus on women. Yes, there's still a lot of issues that impact women, and women still need a lot of help. But we can't allow the boys to lag behind, nor can we be silent on what's happening to them. And in
yeah,
fact, I have heard from mothers, and in fact, in a creative writing class I did, two boys did confess,
mm-hmm,
that and broke down that this happened to them as children. So the same kind of abuse or a similar kind of abuse, I don't know what the data is because we don't have enough data to aggregate what percentage of girls is more than boys or vice versa. But at this point, to me, it's like it's happening to both, and we
mm-hmm,
can and we should simultaneously address both. And so there are poems that, as you say, address these fathers and grandfathers who are
mm-hmm,
homosexual or bisexual or whatever,
yeah,
but who are pedophiles and who do the same thing to their sons that they do to their daughters. And all of us need to be concerned about that. And all of us need to address those social ills that are prevalent in our communities.
yeah. And two other things before we close. In so that was returning seven with the
Hmm.
father, that incestuous relationship, and of course sexual abuse.
Hmm.
Um, and in returning 11, there's that issue there of corporal punishment where you say the storyteller didn't want any child to be hit. I know our gender activist and advocate in Trinidad, Merle Hodge, she
Hmm.
is very much against corporal punishment,
Yeah, you see, I believe people tell me slavery done long time, but in fact
Yeah.
we are less out of slavery than we have been. So that's historically we need to understand that it hasn't been done. And
Mhm.
also what we need to understand is that the damage that was done over generations and generation
Yeah.
continues today.
Mhm.
And in the Caribbean, and I even believe this before I was a child. I mean, when I was a child and before I left the States, because people say it's US
Yeah.
I that we are very harsh. No, we're cruel to our
Mhm.
children, and we beat them and hit them and emotionally degrade them and tell them they're worthless and they're no good. And it's an internalization of our own oppression that was said about us and that was done to us for years that we don't ever realize that we're enacting. And so parents will say to me, or people will say to me, well, I got beaten and look how good I turned.
Yes. Yes. That's the common.
That you didn't turn out too good if you're saying that, right? So I'm sorry. But is that our unwillingness to see how destructive we are and how we can on the one hand say we're not violent and we're against violence, but we're breathing violence into our children all the time. And so I'm totally against corporal punishment. I have three children and I raise them without beating them, and they will confirm that. I do believe it's quite you can raise a child without physically beating that child, without physically letting the child feel like they're worthless. And I
Yeah.
caution parents, particularly single mothers who I know are burdened, and will always say to the children, because many men have told me that, how their mothers say, you're worthless just like you're no good father. Child has nothing to do with the man leaving.
Mhm.
Do not put that on the child.
Yeah. Now, Paul Keynes Douglas,
Hmm.
our of course Trinidad, you have your
Your
Louis.
Trinidadian griot, whom I
Yes,
love.
yes, yes. Of course, your Louise Bennett was Coverley was his inspiration, his mentor. But
Mhm.
in his work, there are two phrases. The way in his dialect poetry, dialect narratives, where his characters say that and I think that too was autobiographical, that he's a reflector of the society and a studier of the society. And of course, that's what storytellers are. You know, they reflect the society, they study us, they study the society, and I said observations and whatnot. And I know that you said you've always been a listener, right? Probably an eavesdropper from since a child. I know that's what writers do. And how much of that do you still I do you consider
Do I still
yourself?
fast? Do I still do I still eavesdrop on people? Yes,
Yes.
it's an essential part of my craft. I
Oh,
hope I do it discreetly.
yes.
Yes, my ears is always alert to whatever stories are out there because that is in fact what I do. I am a storyteller and I gather story about my society and about my culture from being in the world and from hearing what people are saying and what people
Mhm.
are doing.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so I think that's it for the time we've
Yeah,
had,
well, that's great
unless
because I think we have like 4 minutes, so we can wrap it up.
right, unless yes, unless there's anything else you want to say. Now, I can say, admit that when I first heard the title, The Storyteller's Return,
Mhm.
before I actually um, saw the subtitle, I
Mhm.
really thought it was a book of narratives, of shorts, of stories.
Ah,
Yeah, so, and that I really like that, you know, bridging of the narrative form. Of course, we know they're narrative poems, but the title itself, if one may not realize, at least for me, my first impression is this: okay, this is prose. This is entire prose,
okay. Yeah, yeah.
right? And so I find it very, I find the title and the subtitle, story poems, to be very, really, very quite interesting and part of what you're trying to do in this, not trying to do, but what you've done in this poetry collection. The storyteller's return. You didn't say, let's say, the poet's return. If you understand the point
Right,
I'm.
right, yeah.
So I thought that was kind of ingenious as well. The way how you have the crossing of the genres.
Right, and I think a lot of Caribbean writers
Do
uh,
that.
break those genres because
Yes.
it's a European form, and really,
Yes.
what does it mean that you're a poet or you're storytellers? There's so many stories we have to tell. Well, I
Mm-hmm.
just really want to thank you for being such a supporter of my work throughout the years and
Thank you.
interviewing me and reviewing my book. And I think I would like to just end with this poem, A Nameless Return.
Okay.
Them sell me. The damn workless people them sell me out, she insisted from under the tarp at halfway tree, from where she sold men's shirts and underwear. Her voice siren as they shoved her in the police car. They said she grounded ackee seed, then boiled it with oleander, invited him to her home, then gave him the brew to drink from a china cup. Serve him right, she spat. Who tell him to touch me, girl child? The storyteller knew the story, had in fact lived one aspect herself. She knew home was not always a safe haven for little girls, and mothers would have to reclaim their obia to protect them.
One that I really liked as well. Yes. So thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
so
much,
much.
and continued success on your you know, on your craft. And you're such a prolific writer. It's such an inspiration and a motivation. How how hard you work and how much you produce and share with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.